Welcome back to Mindful Stoicism. Have you ever felt that sharp sting of regret when someone you deeply cared about walks out of your life, leaving behind unanswered questions and a sense of confusion? You've probably wondered if they regret it, if they ever think back on the relationship, or if they even care about the pain they left behind. But here's the real twist. What if I told you that she may regret everything, but she will never say it? It's a truth that many of us overlook, but it's rooted in human psychology and the very nature of relationships. Regret can be a heavy burden to carry, but often it's a feeling that stays locked inside, never spoken aloud. You see, when someone walks away, especially if they were once emotionally invested in you, it's common for them to experience regret later. However, admitting that regret can feel like an admission of defeat or failure. It could expose vulnerabilities they'd rather keep hidden. And that's why, even though she might deeply regret her actions, she'll never verbalize it. Why? Because doing so would mean admitting she was wrong, and it's far easier to maintain pride and distance than to risk facing the reality of her decisions. The silence after a breakup, the emotional withdrawal, and the unexplained distance all point to this deep, unspoken regret. But here's the thing, you don't need her to say it for it to be true. In fact, this is where Stoicism comes in. It teaches us that we cannot control how others express their emotions, but we can control how we react. So, let's dive deeper into why this silence exists, and how you can navigate through it with a stoic mindset that empowers you to move forward. Stay tuned, because what I'm about to share will completely shift how you understand the dynamics of relationships. 1. The silent regret. Regret is one of the most powerful and complex emotions we experience, and often it remains unspoken. In relationships, when someone walks away, especially when things end abruptly or unresolved, there's a lingering silence that follows. This silence often hides the deepest emotions of regret, emotions that the person may never vocalize. The silent regret doesn't always come immediately. At first, there might be relief or even anger masking the underlying feelings of loss. But over time, the realization sets in. The absence of someone who once held a significant place in their life creates a void. And that's when regret begins to take root. They start to replay everything, the arguments, the mistakes, the moments they took for granted, and the things they should have said, but didn't. However, the nature of human pride makes regret difficult to express. Admitting regret often requires vulnerability, a willingness to expose the truth of one's actions and decisions. For many, this is the hardest part. Vulnerability opens the door to judgment, rejection, and potential loss of face. To openly say, "I regret everything," is to admit fault, to acknowledge that things could have been different, and that's a tough pill to swallow for anyone. What makes silent regret even more complicated is that it often goes unrecognized by the person who caused the pain. They may carry it quietly, buried beneath layers of pride or shame, too afraid to confront it directly. And so the regret remains in the shadows, never truly addressed, but it lingers, affecting their every thought and decision. The silence can be deafening, as the person carries the weight of their emotions alone, without the relief of confession or reconciliation. Ego and pride at play. Ego and pride play a significant role in why she'll never openly admit her regrets. These two psychological forces are deeply ingrained in human behavior and can sometimes overpower emotional honesty, especially when it comes to relationships. At the core of ego is the need for self-preservation. The ego is our sense of identity and self-worth, and it acts as a protective shield. When someone walks away from a relationship or makes decisions they later regret, acknowledging that regret means confronting a flaw or weakness in oneself. This can be incredibly difficult because admitting regret often forces us to face our own imperfections. For her, acknowledging a mistake might make her feel exposed, vulnerable, and less in control. In her mind, showing this kind of vulnerability could be seen as a sign of weakness. Pride is closely related to ego, but often more visible in interactions. It's the internal force that drives us to maintain a certain image or perception of ourselves. For her, pride might prevent her from ever admitting that she's made a wrong choice or misjudged the relationship. Pride tells her that to admit regret is to lose face, to admit she was wrong, and to show that her initial decision, whether it was leaving or pushing you away, was a failure. This fear of appearing weak or imperfect can create an emotional wall that prevents her from expressing her true feelings. When pride and ego come into play, it becomes harder to connect with raw, honest emotions. Rather than admitting regret, she may convince herself that moving on without addressing it is the better option. Unfortunately, this avoidance doesn't allow for healing or growth, both for her and for the relationship. Ultimately, ego and pride trap her in a cycle where regret festers silently, never finding the release that could lead to resolution or closure. The fear of rejection. The fear of rejection is one of the most powerful and paralyzing emotions that influence human behavior, especially in relationships. When someone walks away, especially someone you care about, it's natural to expect them to come back and confess their feelings, including regret. But why don't they? Why does it seem like they avoid acknowledging their regret, even when it's so clear that they might feel it? The answer often lies in a deep-rooted fear of rejection. For many people, admitting regret is like putting their heart on the line once more, only to face the possibility of being turned away again. Imagine putting yourself out there, being vulnerable and expressing the pain you feel, only for the other person to shut you down. This kind of rejection can be devastating, and it often feels easier to stay silent than risk the emotional wounds that might come with being dismissed. When someone leaves and then feels the weight of regret, they might secretly wish for things to be different. But admitting that regret requires them to face the very real possibility that the other person, you, has moved on, or might not want to hear what they have to say. This fear of being rejected again, especially after walking away in the first place, creates an emotional wall. They fear that their vulnerability might be seen as a weakness, and they might feel ashamed for not realizing their mistake sooner. This fear of rejection is a huge barrier that stops people from reaching out and speaking the truth. It's not that they don't regret their actions, it's that the emotional risk feels too great. And so the silence remains, and the regret stays unspoken. For them, the pain of saying the wrong thing and facing rejection again might seem far worse than carrying the weight of their regret quietly. 4. The Stoic perspective. Stoicism teaches us to focus on what we can control and to release the things outside our influence. This is key when it comes to dealing with unspoken regret, especially in relationships. If someone regrets their actions but never expresses it, Stoicism reminds us that this is beyond our control. We cannot force someone to admit their feelings or validate our worth through their apology or remorse. Instead of focusing on her silent regret, a Stoic would turn inward and reflect on what they can learn from the situation. The core Stoic principle is to take responsibility for our own emotions and reactions, rather than letting the uncertainty or her unspoken feelings dictate your emotional state. A Stoic sees this as an opportunity to practice emotional resilience. The philosophy teaches us to remain indifferent to external circumstances that do not affect our integrity or peace of mind. In this case, her regret or lack thereof should not disturb your tranquility. A key aspect of Stoicism is understanding that other people's actions, especially those driven by pride or fear, are not for us to control. This is empowering because it frees us from the anxiety of waiting for someone else to acknowledge their mistakes. We are taught to focus on virtue, to act with wisdom, justice, courage, and moderation, regardless of how others behave. In the context of regret, a Stoic might acknowledge that she feels sorrow or remorse, but will not let it define the next steps in their life. By focusing on their own growth, they avoid getting trapped in the emotional web of needing closure from someone else. Stoicism teaches that true peace comes from accepting what is and working toward becoming the best version of ourselves, regardless of the actions or regrets of others. 5. Understanding human nature. Human nature is complex, and it's important to recognize that regret, especially in relationships, isn't always something someone is comfortable admitting. Regret isn't just about feeling sorry for a mistake. It's a deeply emotional experience that forces a person to confront their own flaws and misjudgments. The act of regretting means that a person has to acknowledge their own vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and for many, this is incredibly difficult. When someone is faced with the consequences of their actions, especially in a relationship, there's a natural inclination to protect themselves. Our instinct is often to shield our emotions, guard our pride, and avoid looking weak in the eyes of others. For women, in particular, society often reinforces the idea that they must appear emotionally strong, self-sufficient, and in control. Admitting regret could feel like admitting failure, which many would rather avoid. It's also crucial to recognize that people deal with regret in different ways. Some may internalize it, suffer in silence and never speak of it, while others may seek closure or even try to make amends. But in most cases, the fear of rejection or the fear that their regret won't change the outcome keeps them silent. The pain of facing the truth of their actions may be so overwhelming that they prefer to carry it quietly, rather than risk facing the repercussions of speaking up. Furthermore, many people, particularly in relationships, don't want to expose themselves to more emotional vulnerability. If she comes to you to admit regret, it means exposing herself to judgment, potential rejection, and even the risk of opening old wounds. It's often easier for her to leave things unsaid, even if deep down she's carrying a heavy weight of regret. Ultimately, human nature compels us to protect ourselves emotionally, even at the cost of truth and closure. Understanding this helps us to approach the situation with empathy and detachment, rather than frustration or anger. If you've ever been left wondering whether someone regrets their actions, take this as a reminder. If this perspective resonated with you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear this. And let me know in the comments. How do you deal with unspoken regret in relationships? Let's talk about it.